Hi, can you state your name, please?
I'm Victoria Christina.
Okay, and are you a freshman at VCU?
Yes.
Okay, so basically I'm just going to ask you a few questions for this little mini documentary I'm doing for a history project.
Okay.
Okay, so have you ever heard of the Salem witch trials?
Yeah. Everyone knows about the Salem witch trials.
Okay, what do you know about it?
It was in Massachusetts.
Okay, good.
And there are witches, and I don't really know. No.
Please put me to bed and turn down the light. Fall down your hands, give me a sigh, put down your lies. Lay down next to me, don't listen when I scream. Bury your doubts and fall asleep.
Hi, can you state your name?
Cougar Conley.
Okay, and have you ever heard of the Salem witch trials?
I have, in fact, heard of the Salem witch trials.
I've heard the name.
Yes,
Charles?
I have. I have.
Yes.
I have.
Okay, and what do you know about it?
Not much.
I do not know much.
Nothing.
Nothing, great.
Nothing.
The Salem witch trials. Who hasn't heard of them? Most, if not all, have heard the name, learned briefly about them in history classes, seen dramatized television shows inspired by them, was forced to read books in some high school literature class. But how much do most truly know about them? I walked around VCU's campus to gain a better insight. I asked a few students passing by what they know, and although not necessarily wrong, but not entirely accurate, a few had surprising and interesting perspectives. But of course, everyone I interviewed had very limited information. As though the stories of the Salem witch trials are intriguing, most would prefer not to dwell on one of the darkest, most disturbing times in American history.
Okay, so what do you know about the Salem witch trials?
Well, I know that they happened in Salem, which I just found out is in Massachusetts. I think the year was somewhere around 1600s or 1700s, maybe. And the big religious group at the time, which I don't know the name of, thought that some women were witches because of some things that they did.
Salem, Massachusetts is where it all began. It was formerly known as Naumkeag when it was founded in 1626 by Roger Conant and a group of immigrants from Cape Ann. Although Conant kept his settlers alive for 2 years, a newcomer soon replaced him from Massachusetts Bay Company, John Endicott. The transition to power was very peaceful, as Conant graciously stepped down from power and was granted a plot of land. Because of such a diplomatic exchange, the old settlers and the new settlers coexisted peacefully, soon adopting the name Salem, an ancient Greek version of the Hebrew word for peace. John Endicott, stepping to power, along with his group of Massachusetts-based settlers, laid the ground for thousands of Puritans. But who exactly were the Puritans, and how could a seemingly peaceful and conservative religion turn the Village of Peace into a mad, unforgiving hunt against innocence? Tracing back to its origins, all the way to the mother country, Puritanism was a large movement that arose from the Church of England in the 16th century. King Henry VIII is largely credited for the religion's very birth. He was a rather controversial figure at the time of his reign, from 1491 to 1547. He had 6 wives, and of course, 2 marriages in the Roman Catholic Church's eyes was considered sinful. So how could the king possibly achieve 6? Dissatisfied with his first marriage and seeking a divorce, yet simply not allowed to do so by England's long-established Church of Rome, he simply created his own separate Church of England. Thus began the growth of the new religion, Puritanism. In the years to come, a constant struggle between the two separate churches, Catholicism and Puritanism, ensued, as one leader would favor one religion over the other. Puritans faced constant ridicule. Their enemies would reduce them to nothing more than mere slaves of their Bible, a guidebook on how to live their daily lives. Others would accuse them of being hypocrites, as they practiced such a strict religion and frowned upon the Catholic Church, yet would allow something as promiscuous as divorce. They would even appear in countless satire across England. Yet despite constant ridicule, the Protestant movement only gained strength and momentum, as an increasing number of the professional class grew in discontent with the Church of England. Many began to even separate themselves completely from the national church and became known as separatist Puritans, as they believed there was no hope left for England, and the only way they could prosper as Puritans was to break away completely and move to the New World. A large group of these separatists migrated to the place they called Plymouth in New England in 1622, but they are more commonly known today as the famous Pilgrims. A decade later, a group of Puritans arrived and successfully set up the Massachusetts Bay Colony, only they were the non-separatist Puritans. They believed there remained hope for England, and they could serve as the shining city upon a hill, setting an ideal example for the rest of England to follow. From the words of Arthur Miller from his famous playwright, The Crucible, a satire of Salem and its witch trials, they believed, in short, that they held in their steady hands the candle that would light the world, and it has helped and hurt us. The movement exploded in the New World, and the great migration of Puritans spilled into the foreign world, overflowing the borders of New England and swelling into more and more Indian territory. The American continent stretched endlessly west, and it was full of mystery for them. Yet as the Puritans pushed for more and more land, disputes among the Indians worsened. Many believed it was their responsibility to convert the Indians, as they were seen as followers of the devil. Because of many failures to convert the natives, however, the Puritans remained wary of the Indians in the unconquered forests. The Salem folk believed that the virgin forest was the devil's last preserve, his home base, and the citadel of his final stand. The lingering wariness and spreading fears of the unconquered forest, the home of the devil and his many worshippers, the natives, will soon have tremendous influence on the mass hysteria that became the Salem witch trials.
I mean, so you don't believe in witches?
I would have to say that no, I do not believe in witches.
Do you believe in witches?
No, I don't.
So why do you think they were accused of being witches?
Because they believed in witches.
I don't remember the particular reasons, but people were crazy back then.
True.
That's about all I know.
Yes, they were crazy. It's a simple way to think about such a phenomenon today. I mean, how can an entire community of people be convinced enough of their neighbors bewitching them to execute them completely? The whole village must have been simply insane. But it is important to take a step back and evaluate the whole picture. Well, for one, how could they believe in witches? Because it was simply part of the Puritan religion. As discussed earlier, the criticism received by the Puritans wasn't entirely just criticism. They were, in many ways, slaves of their Bible, as they worshipped every word as the ultimate truth. They believed in witchcraft similarly to the way they believed in Jesus, as both were written into the Word of God. The concept of witchcraft has existed throughout history and in various ancient cultures. Witchcraft in Europe, thanks to the Church, found its origins in the idea of heresy, or the non-acceptance of the Church's teachings, dating all the way back to the early thousands. Persecution of witchcraft, in particular, persisted throughout the Middle Ages into the 10th century. From the 15th century, the idea of the pact, or a deal made with the devil, grew in popularity and importance, as it explained how commoners could perform such horrific acts of sorcery. From the 1300s, the fear of witchcraft and witch hunting gradually spread throughout Europe, but by the end of the Middle Ages, the fear erupted into a craze that lasted for over 200 years. Tens of thousands of trials were held from generation to generation throughout Europe. Suspects were identified in the public trial by being shaven from head to toe and thoroughly examined for a devil's mark, and would stick a needle in any blemish found. Any spot that failed to bleed was deemed a mark of Satan. Witches were also believed to weigh very little to nothing at all. They were dunked into a body of cold water. If they sank, they were considered innocent and pulled out. If they stayed afloat, they would soon be executed as a witch. Others were simply weighed in the courtroom. So, naturally, a long-established superstition of witches carried over into the New World. Witch hunts were universally accepted throughout the Massachusetts Bay Colony, so when strange, unexplainable afflictions and incidents spread throughout Salem, witchcraft was thought to be the only reasonable explanation. A series of unexplainable events paved the way for the massive witch hunt in Salem, but it all began in the household of the town's Puritan minister, Reverend Samuel Parris. Parris had moved to Boston, Massachusetts after his inherited land in Barbados had been devastated by a hurricane. In July 1689, he became the minister of Salem Village, but it wasn't so easy of a task. He had been just the fourth minister of many unsuccessful attempts for the town to find a permanent one. He had at first hesitated when offered the position, had disputes over his compensation, and in October of 1691, the town even agreed to stop paying his wages altogether. But the events that spurred on the witch trials didn't erupt from his small disputes with the town, but instead began with one of his daughters, Betty Parris, and her cousin, Abigail Williams. Without any explanation, one day the two girls began to exhibit bizarre and frightening behavior. They began having fits, spontaneous screaming in pain, and crying of invisible spirits pinching them. Bewildered and at a loss for an answer, Reverend Parris called in the town doctor, who provided even less answers. Back then, when doctors were unable to diagnose an unexplainable illness, it was thought reasonable to think the girls were simply bewitched. A devastated Parris sought to keep the bewitching a secret, as he couldn't have the town breaking into a frenzy without a practical solution. Without his knowledge, however, his neighbor, Mary Sibley, was determined to find out who could possibly be cursing the poor young girls. She called upon the help of John and Tituba, the two Parris servants, to help her bake a cake made of rye and the afflicted girl's urine, and fed it to a dog, in hopes that the guilty's names would be revealed. Yep, definitely crazy, right? But just a few days after baking the cake, as their symptoms took a turn for the worse, Abigail and Betty finally named who they thought to be bewitching them: Sarah Osborne, Sarah Good, and their own servant, Tituba. The three women were immediately arrested upon the accusations and examined on March 1st, 1692. But of course, merely 3 accusations could only spark suspicion, but not an immediate frenzy. In fact, many historians believe the witch hunts would have ended with those 3 arrests, that is, if it weren't for Tituba's testimony. As the 2 girls writhed in pain, Tituba was brought into a small meeting house packed with wary Salem residents, the same house in which she had prayed alongside the Parris family for many years. She was kept in prison before her interrogation, as a Salem town justice by the name of John Hathorne, a very prominent figure in the bulk of the early witch trials, decided to interrogate the dark-skinned slave lass. But Tituba's trial wasn't like the others before her. As to the absolute shock of the town and the judges, she had confessed to witchcraft and bewitching the girls, claiming the devil had forced her into hurting the children. But the devil wasn't alone, as she wasn't the sole witch of the town, and even proceeded to give a list of names of the many witches that lived amongst them, thus sparking the hysteria that became the Salem witch trials. The epidemic of strange behaviors and accusations did not spread to other victims until after Tituba's arrest. The conclusion of Tituba's remarkable confession marked a new chapter in the witch hunt episodes of New England. Tituba's confession is the key to understanding why the events of 1692 took on such epic significance.
Who do you think they thought were witches?
Well, women primarily, because witches are typically women. I don't know why they didn't have anything against wizards. That's kind of a little bit of a
Yeah, okay.
sexist stereotype going on there. But
Who were the accused? It is a common misconception to associate the target of the trials to be purely women. Typically, the term witch is expressed by a woman in a pointy hat flying around on a broomstick. Yes, back then, it was a common belief that women were far weaker and more susceptible to the devil's influences, and, therefore, any woman with a temper could fall immediately under suspicion of being a witch. But this doesn't necessarily mean that in the Salem trials, the accused were solely women. In fact, anyone was in danger of being accused, regardless of one's gender or power. So, who were the accused? Well, for starters, it was no surprise Tituba was amongst the first to be accused. As discussed earlier, the natives of the land were greatly feared by the Salem residents. Similarly to the earlier European witch trials, the natives were seen as heretics, and, therefore, worshippers of the devil. The Indian Wars that erupted throughout the New World were only 70 miles away from Salem, so to the residents of Salem, the devil lived only 70 miles away, and his influence suddenly seemed to enclose the town. Anyone could be recruited to join his ranks, and many were seen as far more vulnerable than others. So, of course, when the girls of the Reverend household began having unexplainable and hysterical episodes, it was instinct to turn their heads to Tituba, as her dark complexion resembled those of the natives. Even though she was believed to be of South American origin, she far too closely resembled who they believed to be Satan's worshippers. Tituba was accused of many bizarre behaviors. She was believed to have practiced voodoo and taught the Salem girls fortune-telling. "I saw Tituba waving her arms over the fire when I came on you. Why was she doing that? And I heard a screeching and gibberish coming from her mouth. She were swaying like a dumb beast over that fire." Tituba's confession to these wild accusations, then, only confirmed the lingering fears that swept over the town. Their crippling fears soon clouded their judgments, as they believed every name Tituba gave to be guilty, regardless of if they were their very own neighbors. Her name-giving soon spurred on a domino effect, as many began to point fingers to anyone and everyone, the mad witch hunt seeming to gain momentum overnight. Suddenly, anyone could be a witch. One of the most influential and adamant accusers that had a great impact on the trials was Abigail Williams, as according to court records, she had accused 57 people of witchcraft. Yet despite these many accusations, she only testified against 8 of them: Mary Eastie, George Jacobs, Susanna Martin, Rebecca Nurse, John Proctor, Elizabeth Proctor, Mary Witheridge, and John Willard. Of the people she accused, 15 were executed. But she wasn't the only one to make mad accusations against just about anyone in town. Other girls such as Ann Putnam and Mary Warren joined Betty and Abigail's group of accusations. During court proceedings for the accused, the girls would interrupt it with sudden outbursts, making strange sounds, having hallucinations, and crying out that they were being pricked and poked. No matter if the accused pleaded innocent, the girls' outbursts would sway the judge's opinion towards guilt, believing they had to be bewitching the girls. Mary Warren, however, feeling immense guilt from the harm she and the girls were causing, admitted her and the girls were making everything up. Shortly afterward, the girls accused Mary of witchcraft out of spite, and though Mary eventually escaped imprisonment, she never spoke out against the girls again. Dedicated church members and respected families of the town were also easily accused. Even 71-year-old Rebecca Nurse was accused of witchcraft. On March 24th, she was brought to the meeting house and interrogated by John Hathorne and Reverend Paris. Despite her denial of such accusations, she was eventually hanged after Ann Putnam had interrupted the trial. Another, much more prominent figure that was tried for witchcraft was a man by the name of George Burroughs. He may have been the least likely witch of all, as he was a minister of a very high status and rank with no bad reputation at all. So, why was he accused? For starters, he had a bit of bad blood with the Putnam family, as he had borrowed money from them in the past and was unable to pay them back, leaving Salem to move to Wells. Although he had eventually paid them back, he was charged, arrested, and brought back to Salem 20 years later. Many members of Salem Village testified against him, and a man by the name of Cotton Mather personally oversaw his execution due to Burroughs' unorthodox church teachings. Back then, it was believed that any servant of the devil couldn't possibly recite the Lord's Prayer. So in a last-ditch effort to save his own life, Burroughs recited the entire prayer in front of the crowd. In utter shock and sympathy, the crowd rushed forward and tried to untie him, for a moment coming to their senses. Cotton Mather, however, urged the crowd that Burroughs was surely a witch, and on August 19, 1692, became the only Puritan minister in history to be executed. So, how were they executed exactly?
All I know is that if I'm thinking about the same thing, they tie rocks to these women and sink them down a lake.
They burn people, right? Alive?
They hung them up, or they tied them up, or they burned them down, and they still weren't witches, so it's kind of a waste of humanity.
It is a popular myth that the executions of the Salem witch trials were carried out through burnings at the stake while the victim was alive, but in fact, none of the condemned were burned at the stake. It is possible that the myth of public burnings arose from the medieval executions discussed earlier, but even in these executions were the punished beheaded or hanged first, and only burned after death to protect against post-mortem sorcery. So in Salem, the 19 of the accused were instead taken to the infamous Gallows Hill to die by a slow, painful hanging, but the majority of the accused died in jail while awaiting trial. Perhaps the most disturbing means of execution in Salem, however, was the fate of elderly Giles Corey, who was pressed to death by large rocks after refusing to plead innocent or guilty. By October 1692, over 150 persons were thrown in jail while 19 were found guilty and hanged. By the following year, Salem was exhausted from the witchcraft frenzy and even learned many of the witnesses that had testified had been untruthful with their testimonies. When the trials continued in January, all of the remaining evidence was deemed insufficient, and finally, the worst North American witch trials had faded to an end. One of the darkest times in American history continue to haunt our past. The Salem witch trials was a period of such irrational hysteria and ruthlessness, it may be hard to accept as reality. How can an entire community commit such heartless acts, accusing neighbor after neighbor, hanging another after another? The first question lies in the woman who started it all, Tituba. How could she have not only admitted to witchcraft, but also pointed her finger towards others in town? There are several theories. One that she had admitted to herself in a later testimony, withdrawing her crazy accusations from before, was that she was beaten by her master, Reverend Paris, and was forced to confess. Another possible reason is that Tituba, being merely a slave, had nothing to lose and knew that a confession could save her life. Modern theorists believe that the other two girls who started the frenzy, Betty and Abigail, had their weird, unexplainable outbursts due to boredom, child abuse, epilepsy, mental illness, or even a disease brought on by eating fungus and rye bread. As for the others who wildly accused others, it is possible they were simply attacking those who they had bad blood with or resented. Long-held hatred of neighbors could now be openly expressed, and vengeance taken, despite the Bible's charitable injunctions. Others may have simply accused others of being witches in hopes of saving themselves from being accused and executed, as if you had given the names of other witches, you would be pardoned. Regardless of the reasons why, the Salem witch trials were one of the darkest chapters in early colonial American history. As blood was being shed with the natives, blood was being shed within own neighborhoods, friend turning on friend, family turning on family, and an entire community resorting to murder in order to relieve their own irrational fears. It may be reasonable to stop a stranger and ask them if they have heard of the trials, as it is a name that cannot easily be forgotten. But when you ask them how much they truly know, most would come up blank, as it is much easier to forget about such a dark time in our history than to truly learn, in depth, how an event as tragic as the Salem witchcraft trials could ever happen.